The man kneeling in the mud didn't quite fit in with the immaculate parking lot of St. Luke's Hospital in Boston. His Italian suit, charcoal grey, tailored, was stained up to his knees. His Swiss watch, valued at more than the annual salary of most people rushing past, reflected a heavy, rain-laden sky. Yet no one seemed to notice. Or perhaps they did notice and chose to ignore it. Richard Hale had always been invisible when he needed to be seen, and seen when he preferred to disappear. That morning his world had crumbled in less than 15 minutes. A short, technical, almost bureaucratic phone call. A doctor who didn't bother to soften his words. A diagnosis that didn't allow for negotiation, money, or influence. And now there he was, the man who controlled boards of directors, markets, and professional destinies, reduced to a hunched body, his hands buried in the mud, trying to understand how control had slipped away so completely. The hospital's automatic door opened behind him with a mechanical whisper. People came and went, hurried nurses, tired families, children clutching worn toys. None of them were part of Richard Hale's world. Or at least that's what he had believed for decades, until I heard the voice, "Young man, did you fall?" It was weak but firm. It didn't come from above like all the other voices Richard was used to. It came from below. He turned his face slowly. A few meters away, a child in a wheelchair watched the scene with unusual attention for someone so young. The boy was perhaps 8 or 9 years old. His motionless legs were covered by a blue blanket, decorated with small faded stars. His hands, however, were clean, resting carefully on the arms of the chair, as if this were territory he knew too well to treat carelessly. The boy's eyes showed no pity, nor morbid curiosity. There was something more disconcerting there, recognition. Richard tried to stand up. His foot slipped. The mud gave way again, drawing a short, involuntary sound from him, almost a cry for help that never quite came out. "Wait," said the boy, turning the chair slightly with visible effort. "Not like that. Hold my hand." Richard frowned. This was absurd. A child in a wheelchair. He, a man of almost 50, healthy, strong, but the ground wouldn't cooperate. His body wouldn't either. And for the first time in a long time, pride couldn't prevail over necessity. He extended his hand. The boy's fingers were small but firm. They didn't pull. They didn't push. They just stayed there, steady, like a fixed point amidst the chaos. Richard used that unlikely support to regain his balance. When he finally managed to stand up, the mud still marked his clothes, but something deeper had shifted inside him. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice hoarser than he intended. The boy smiled slightly, as if that expression of gratitude was just a small detail. "My name is Ethan," he said. "I'm here almost every day." Richard nodded, unsure what to say. He never stayed in one place for very long, especially not in hospitals. On the other side of the entrance, a woman watched the scene with silent attention. Her face was tired, but her eyes were alert. She approached, carefully pushing the chair. "He helps more people than you realize," she said to Richard. "Even though he can't get up." Richard recognized at that moment something that disconcerted him more than the diagnosis, more than the mud, more than the hospital. The clear feeling of standing before a mirror that reflected not power, status, or success, only fragility. "Richard Hale," he said almost reflexively, as if the name still carried some weight there. The woman simply nodded. She showed no surprise. She asked for nothing. She merely thanked her son with a light touch on the shoulder and guided the chair into the hospital. Richard stood still for a few seconds, watching the two disappear down the white hallway. The sound of the automatic door closing seemed all too final. He didn't know it yet, but that meeting, short, silent, seemingly irrelevant, had set in motion something that no acquisition, merger, or contract had been able to provoke. Inside the hospital, a silent battle unfolded. Not just between doctors and illness, but between everything Richard believed himself to be and everything he was about to lose. And at some point along the way, a child who couldn't walk would become the impossible variable in an equation he had never learned to solve. The rain began to fall harder. Richard Hale didn't move. For the first time, he was in no hurry to return to the world that had always obeyed his rules. Boston had never been kind to those who walked slowly. The city rewarded firm steps, full schedules, and quick decisions. Richard Hale had always thrived there precisely because of that. For 30 years, he had learned to move as the city demanded, crossing corporate corridors with the same nonchalance with which he traversed busy streets without looking to the sides. St. Luke's Hospital, however, operated at a different pace. Inside, time didn't obey expensive clocks or appointments scheduled in digital calendars. Time there was measured in monitored heartbeats, awaited test results, and held breaths. Richard began to frequent that place with a regularity he had never imagined, not as a hurried visitor, but as someone who needed to stay. The doctors had been clear. The heart problem was serious, silent, and required constant monitoring. No long trips, no stress, an almost ironic recommendation for a man whose identity had been built precisely under pressure. It was during this forced interval that he saw Ethan again. The boy was almost always in the same spot in the lobby, near the large window overlooking the inner garden. His wheelchair remained strategically positioned, allowing him to observe who came and went. Ethan seemed to know the hospital better than many of the staff. He knew which nurses smiled the most, which doctors avoided eye contact, which patients returned, and which didn't. Richard began to notice details that had previously escaped him. The way Ethan gripped the arms of his chair when someone passed by too quickly. The way his mother, Laura, maintained a firm posture, even though her shoulders betrayed chronic fatigue. She always wore simple, functional clothes and carried an oversized bag, as if she were prepared for any unforeseen event. Laura worked at the hospital itself, in the administrative wing. Long shifts, tight salary, schedules adjusted around her son's therapies. She didn't talk about it. Richard discovered this by observing, not asking. He saw her reviewing papers while Ethan slept, when she discreetly negotiated with receptionists for medical appointments, when she smiled at her son with a naturalness that hid sleepless nights. Ethan, for his part, never complained. His physical limitation hadn't made him passive. On the contrary, he communicated more with his eyes than with words. He paid attention to adults as if he were always learning something important. Sometimes he would call Richard over with a short nod, inviting him to sit beside him. The conversations were simple, comments about the weather, about the people passing by, about how that hospital changed its mood depending on the day. Richard didn't talk about business. He didn't talk about money. For the first time in decades, nobody expected anything from him besides his presence. Outside the hospital, Richard's world was beginning to show cracks. At Hale Industries, his prolonged absence caused unease. The board of directors was pressing for decisions. Vice President Mark Caldwell had temporarily assumed some functions, with an efficiency bordering on ambition. Richard perceived, even from a distance, that the balance of power was shifting. Contracts awaited signature. Investors wanted guarantees, and for the first time, Richard wasn't rushing to meet them. There was something disconcerting about realizing that the company continued to function without him. Mark Caldwell represented everything Richard had been in his early 30s, aggressive, strategic, impatient with weaknesses. A man who saw people as replaceable parts. Richard recognized this with a mixture of familiarity and discomfort. It was like looking at a younger version of himself, before any questioning, before any loss. In the hospital, this logic did not apply. There, every small step forward was celebrated. A test that came back as expected, a day without pain, a smile amidst the heavy routine. Richard began to understand, albeit reluctantly, that success could be measured in ways that had never appeared in his quarterly reports. Ethan became the most obvious point of contrast. The boy couldn't walk, but he seemed to be constantly progressing. He learned to maneuver the chair with precision. He knew when to ask for help and when to persevere on his own. He observed the world with a maturity that disconcerted healthy adults. There were days when he arrived quieter, his face tense. Richard realized that this coincided with more difficult physiotherapy sessions or invasive examinations. Even so, Ethan never distanced himself from people. He never closed himself off. On a particularly cold afternoon, Richard watched from the lobby window as the first snow of the year covered the inner garden. Ethan slowly moved his chair closer. "Snow makes everything look the same," the boy commented. "It hides what's ugly." Richard didn't answer immediately. That simple phrase had struck a nerve. He had spent his entire life trying to hide flaws beneath layers of success, money, and control. Laura watched the two of them from afar. She had noticed the change in Richard even before he himself admitted it. The man who had arrived there weeks before, rigid and distant, now listened more than he spoke. He sat on the ground in the inner garden when Ethan wanted to get closer to the snow. He dirtied his expensive shoes again and didn't seem to mind. The hospital, the city, the company, the child in the wheelchair, and the millionaire in freefall now formed a delicate, interconnected system. Every decision began to carry emotional weight. Every choice had an impact beyond the immediate. Richard didn't yet know that this silent coexistence was building something bigger, something that would definitively bring their two worlds into conflict. But the ground had already been prepared, and when the structure began to crumble, it wouldn't just be a matter of losing money or power. It would be a question of who he would choose to be when there was nothing left to control. The first concrete rupture occurred on a Monday morning when Richard ignored 3 consecutive calls from the administrative board. He was in the hospital, sitting in one of the plastic chairs in the children's ward corridor, watching Ethan try for the 10th time to transfer his own body from the chair to the physiotherapy table without direct assistance. The physiotherapist remained nearby, attentive but silent. The rule was clear. Only intervene if there was a real risk. Ethan's effort was visible. His arms trembled. His breathing became short. Still, he persisted. Richard felt the automatic urge to stand up, to interrupt, to impose a quicker solution. It was a reflection of a lifetime spent solving problems with immediate decisions. But he restrained himself. This was not a business meeting. Haste there would be a form of violence. Ethan succeeded, not elegantly nor quickly, but he succeeded. When he finally settled onto the stretcher, a discreet smile appeared, not of absolute victory, but of progress. At that very moment, Richard's cell phone vibrated again. Mark Caldwell. This time, Richard answered. "We need you here," Mark said bluntly. "The European Fund wants an answer by the end of the day. Without your signature, the deal falls through." Richard looked at Ethan, now focused on the exercises guided by the physiotherapist. Each movement was small, almost imperceptible, but full of intention. "Then drop it," Richard replied, hanging up before Mark could argue. The decision wasn't impulsive. It was a difficult one, and it had immediate consequences. Hours later, financial news outlets began to speculate. Hale Industries' stock fluctuated. Analysts questioned the leadership. For the first time, Richard's name appeared associated with the word instability. At the hospital, tension was also rising, although for different reasons. Ethan had received a new, complementary diagnosis. His neurological condition, previously considered stable, was showing signs of regression. Therapies would need to be intensified. The risk of further loss of mobility was real. Laura listened to the news in silence. She nodded. "You asked practical questions. You mentally adjusted work schedules." Only then, in the empty hallway, did she allow herself to rest her forehead against the wall for a few seconds longer than necessary. Richard witnessed this without interfering. He didn't offer money. He didn't offer solutions. He offered something he didn't usually give: his constant presence. He began to reorganize his routine around the hospital. Video meetings became rare. Strategic decisions were postponed. The board reacted with impatience. Mark with opportunity. Internally, Hale Industries was beginning to split. Part of the board advocated for Richard's temporary replacement. Another part believed that his image was still essential to maintaining market confidence. The impasse created an environment of veiled competition. Mark Caldwell wasted no time. He began to act as the ultimate leader. He made promises to investors. He accelerated cost-cutting measures. These included an optimization program that would affect contracts with hospital suppliers and medical foundations, sectors that, coincidentally, served institutions like St. Luke's. Richard discovered this by chance, recognizing a supplier's name during a casual conversation among hospital staff. The impact would be direct. Fewer resources, less equipment, less support for long-term patients. For the first time, the two worlds collided explicitly. Richard confronted Mark by phone that night. The conversation was short, tense, and lacked cordiality. "This is business," Mark said. "It's not personal." Richard hung up without answering. For the first time, that justification made absolutely no sense. In the hospital, Ethan began to feel the effects of the intensified therapies. More fatigue, more silence, fewer occasional jokes. Still, he continued to appear in the lobby, observing people, maintaining his vigil. On a rainy afternoon, similar to their first meeting, Ethan beckoned Richard with a slow gesture. "You seem heavy," she said, choosing her words carefully, "as if you'd fallen again." Richard sat down on the floor next to the chair. "Maybe I have," he replied. Ethan thought for a few seconds, then hold my hand again. Richard obeyed, not because he needed to get up, but because he needed to remember. The conflict was no longer merely external, between an executive and his company, between a board and its absent leader. It was internal. Every choice Richard made distanced him from the man he had been and brought him closer to something he didn't yet fully understand. And as Mark consolidated power and Ethan's conditions became more uncertain, the space for indecision diminished. Something had to give. Either Richard would regain control the old way, or he would lose much more than money. The pressure began to spread in layers, like invisible cracks in a structure that seemed too solid to fail. Nothing collapsed all at once. Everything gave way gradually. At St. Luke's, the children's ward began operating at its limit. Shared equipment, shorter physiotherapy sessions, overworked staff. The reduction in external contracts was beginning to translate into difficult decisions, and no one needed to explain where it was coming from. The effects were felt in the details: rescheduled appointments, postponed exams, accumulated fatigue. Laura noticed it before almost everyone else. Her administrative job gave her access to numbers, spreadsheets, and internal emails. She saw the downward trend before it became visible in the daily lives of patients. Still, she remained discreet. She knew that open protests rarely benefited those who needed it most. Richard, on the other hand, felt guilt creeping in. He recognized the signatures, the contracts, the efficiency policies he himself had approved in the past. All of that had been created to maximize results, not to protect real people. For the first time, the numbers had names. They had faces. They had a child in a wheelchair trying to keep smiling. Meanwhile, another subplot was unfolding outside the hospital. The financial press intensified its scrutiny. Reporters began calling Richard's press office, questioning his health, his leadership abilities, and his prolonged absence. One speculative article raised the possibility of a permanent departure. The stock fluctuated again. Mark Caldwell fueled the fire with calculated precision. He didn't attack Richard directly. He simply made himself available, present, and efficient. He met with investors. He gave controlled interviews. He spoke of responsible transition, strategic continuity, and long-term vision. Within the company, long-time employees began to grow uneasy. Many had grown up under Richard's tough yet predictable leadership. Mark represented something different: speed without loyalty, goals with no room for error. Layoffs began to occur at intermediate levels, silent, justified, inevitable. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Ethan was facing a subplot of his own. A new, older boy began attending the physiotherapy ward, tall for his age, strong, but with a recent spinal injury. Unlike Ethan, he harbored anger. He refused help. He mocked the exercises. He observed Ethan's wheelchair with barely disguised contempt. The tension between the two wasn't expressed in direct words, but in glances, in heavy silences. Richard perceived this without interfering. He knew that not every conflict needed an adult mediator. One day, during a joint session, the older boy failed at a simple exercise. He lost his balance and fell. Frustration came before pain. He pushed the physiotherapist away and turned his face to the wall. Ethan slowly moved the chair closer. "Falling isn't the end," he said softly. "It's just the ground saying, try another way." The boy didn't answer, but the next day, he tried again. Richard watched the scene intently. There was a lesson there that he himself was resisting learning. Another subplot was unfolding in the relationship between Richard and Laura. Constant cohabitation created a silent intimacy. Not romantic, not explicit. A partnership based on mutual understanding. Laura didn't ask for financial help, although Richard knew he could offer it. He didn't offer life advice. They both respected boundaries. Still, there were moments of genuine connection. Looks that spoke louder than words. Small gestures, a coffee left on the table, a rearranged schedule, a shared silence after a difficult day. Laura was beginning to see in Richard not the millionaire from the newspapers, but a man in transition. Someone who had lost his footing and was still learning to find his balance. Time, however, was becoming a common enemy. Ethan's condition demanded quick decisions. New, expensive, and experimental treatments were available at specialized centers out of state. The chance of improvement existed, but so did the risk. Laura hesitated, not just because of the money, but because of the uncertainty. Richard knew he could resolve the issue with a single bank transfer, but something held him back. Perhaps the fear of turning everything back into a transaction, perhaps the apprehension of crossing a line that would forever alter that carefully constructed relationship. The subplots slowly converged, creating a knot that was difficult to untangle. The hospital was suffering. The company was distancing itself from its founder. Ethan faced increasingly rigid limits. Laura needed to decide how far she would go, and Richard was at the center of it all, feeling the growing weight of choices that could no longer be postponed. There was no more room for neutrality. The day began like any other, with a light rain turning the streets of Boston into slippery rivers. Richard walked down the hospital corridor, still lost in thought, when he received an urgent call from the head of the lab team. Ethan's results had arrived earlier than expected. Something in the tests indicated an unexpected complication. The progression of the disease, which had remained stable until then, now threatened to accelerate dramatically. Richard's heart raced. He felt the weight of all the decisions accumulated over weeks, compressed into seconds. The image of his first fall in the mud returned, vivid, reminding him that every moment could be decisive, and every action imperfect. As he absorbed the news, a figure rushed into the room: Mark Caldwell. Richard didn't know how he had managed to find his direct number at the hospital, but there he was, like a specter of the old life he was trying to leave behind. "Richard, we need to close the deal today," Mark said firmly, his eyes fixed, as if each word carried an ultimatum. If you don't sign now, we lose investors and total control. Richard looked at him and then at the wheelchair beside him, where Ethan watched silently. For the first time, he grasped the depth of the dilemma. His decisions didn't just affect charts or contracts. They affected lives. They affected the future of someone who trusted him. I can't sign, Richard said, his voice heavy with determination and fear. Not today. Not now. Mark smiled, but not in a friendly way. It was a calculated, cold smile that showed dominance. So you've lost everything. At that moment, the unexpected happened. Ethan, in a way almost impossible for a child in his physical condition, moved the wheelchair with enough force to reach Richard. He extended his small but firm hand and said, "Hold my hand." The scene was simple, but it carried a power Richard had never experienced. Pure, unconditional, selfless trust. When he held the boy's hand, a devastating clarity flashed through his mind. All the contracts, all the actions, all the power, none of it mattered if he wasn't there for it. Richard realized with painful clarity that his life up to that point had been built on illusions of control. He could lose businesses, money, status, but he could still influence what truly mattered, and upon recognizing this, something changed within him. At that same moment, an alert on her cell phone indicated a message from Laura. "Ethan needs you now. Don't wait." There was no time for diplomacy. Time was becoming increasingly scarce. Richard, for the first time, made a decision that combined courage and vulnerability. He shut Mark down, ignored reports, and rushed Ethan to the emergency room, feeling the rain hit his face and wash away any trace of the pride that had once defined him. As they walked through the corridors, Richard realized that the turning point wasn't just Ethan's illness, nor the threat of losing the company. It was understanding that real life, the one that truly mattered, demanded presence, courage, and empathy, and that some hands, however small, could show the way when he himself was lost. In the emergency room corridor, doctors prepared to act quickly. The pace quickened, every second counted. Richard held Ethan's hand tightly, feeling the responsibility pulsing in both of them, and realized that nothing, not even the mud in the parking lot, had prepared him for this. The world he knew had changed in minutes, and nothing would be the same after that moment. The impact of the turning point spread rapidly, like ripples on a lake after a stone is thrown. At the hospital, the medical team sprang into action with calculated precision. Every nurse, every technician, every doctor knew that the next few minutes would be decisive. The tension hung in the air, visible in quick gestures, direct glances, and firm steps. Richard stayed by Ethan's side, holding his hand. Every movement the boy made seemed amplified by the fear and hope he carried. The presence of the millionaire, the man accustomed to controlling everything around him, now seemed small in the face of the child's simultaneous fragility and strength. He couldn't buy time or results. Everything depended on the dedication, attention, and empathy of whoever was there at the right moment. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, Hale Industries began to feel the effects of Richard's prolonged absence. Mark Caldwell consolidated his leadership position, but the rush to maintain control led to hasty decisions. Some investors began to question the unilateral management and the ethics of the measures taken. The instability in the stock price brought a perception of risk that Mark could not contain. Within the company, employees who had previously remained neutral began to take a stand. Some supported Caldwell's continued tenure, while others lamented Richard's absence, acknowledging that his strategic vision, although rigid, was balanced. Small internal conflicts began to emerge, creating a tense and unpredictable environment. In the hospital, Ethan's recovery required constant attention. The complications were not only medical, but also emotional. The boy oscillated between courage and fear, joy and frustration. Each small victory was celebrated carefully, each setback analyzed with patience. Richard learned to observe, to listen, to interpret signs without acting rashly. Laura, in turn, began to see Richard in a different light. He was no longer the cold and distant executive. He was someone capable of giving himself without measuring efforts, of recognizing limits, of committing to what truly mattered. The respect and trust between them grew silently, but deeply. The combination of external and internal pressures began to transform Richard. He realized that decisions made based solely on logic or power did not carry the same weight as those made with empathy and presence. The corporate world remained demanding, but he now saw limits he had previously ignored. The clash of realities brought an immediate lesson. The vulnerability of one human being can reveal strength in another. Ethan, though physically limited, became a catalyst for profound change. Richard began to act differently, balancing personal and professional responsibilities. He recognized that not all battles need to be won with money or authority. Some require patience, observation, and emotional courage. While the rain beat outside, the hospital corridors echoed with decisions, reactions, and changes. Every gesture, every choice, every act of care shaped the future of everyone involved. The crisis wasn't over, but Richard understood for the first time the true meaning of impact and consequence, and the responsibility of being truly present when it mattered. The following weeks brought a relentless pace. Richard found himself living on the edge between his old routine of power and the new reality of the hospital. Every professional decision was filtered through a conscience he had ignored for decades, that human impact was more relevant than any profit chart. Despite his limitations, Ethan became a silent teacher. The boy faced each physiotherapy session with impressive persistence. When he fell, he got up with a determination that disarmed the skepticism of any adult. Richard, observing, learned to celebrate small advances instead of immediate results. He began to understand that strength was not only physical or financial, but also emotional and moral. Laura clearly noticed the transformation. The man who had arrived at the hospital arrogant, confident, and distant now appeared vulnerable, yet effective. He had learned to listen, to wait, to act without controlling himself. Small daily gestures, bringing coffee, helping Ethan organize exercise materials, accompanying him to appointments, showed a genuine dedication without needing recognition. In the corporate world, Richard began applying lessons learned from Ethan and Laura. Decisions about investments, contracts, and partnerships began to consider the impact on real people, employees, customers, and suppliers. This initially generated distrust from Mark Caldwell and some board members, but gradually the results began to become visible. Hale Industries not only maintained its position, but began to consolidate an unprecedented reputation for social responsibility under Richard's direct leadership, even if on a smaller scale. Ethan also grew in this process, although physically limited. He developed greater autonomy in his wheelchair, learning to move around in more complex spaces, facing obstacles that previously seemed impossible. Each small achievement became symbolic for Richard. The child's persistence reflected his own need to overcome fears and limitations. The bond between Richard and Ethan intensified naturally. The millionaire, accustomed to transactions and contracts, began to realize that trust and affection could not be bought. Learning to compromise, to be patient, and to act without haste became a form of growth he had never found in the corridors of his company or in luxury hotels. Life outside the hospital was transformed. Richard prioritized presence over control, observation over immediate intervention. He began to participate in important decisions with clarity, but without the anxiety that had previously dominated him. Each of Ethan's successes, each smile he earned, each physical progress was reflected in small personal victories, solidifying a more attentive, humane man connected to the world he had previously ignored. And at its core, a deeper change was taking place. Richard was learning to deal with failures and uncertainties, no longer as weaknesses, but as opportunities for growth. He didn't need to be perfect. He needed to be present. Overcoming adversity didn't come from a single heroic act, but from the sum of small steps, holding hands, waiting, observing, learning. Each day was a lesson in empathy and courage, not in power or authority. Richard Hale, the man who had fallen in the mud and found strength in a child's hand, was becoming someone capable of transforming not only his own life, but also the lives of everyone around him. Winter had arrived in Boston with a vengeance, covering streets and gardens with snow and ice. At the hospital, Ethan's routine remained demanding. Longer physical therapy sessions, detailed examinations, and constant medical evaluations. Every progress was celebrated, every setback carefully analyzed. Richard followed closely, learning to interpret the signs, to perceive when to intervene and when only to offer support. Outside the hospital, the pressure on Richard mounted. Mark Caldwell, realizing that the millionaire's absence did not signify submission or defeat, began to act more aggressively. Financial news speculated about mergers, shareholder instability, and possible leadership changes. Investors pressed on, demanding quick decisions. The tension created an atmosphere of urgency that Richard had never faced in his own company. Within this context, Laura began planning a move to a specialized center out of state, where Ethan could receive advanced treatments. The decision was not simple. It involved significant costs, complex logistics, and above all, an emotional adjustment for the boy. Richard found himself in the dilemma he had always avoided, choosing between following rules, contracts, and corporate logic, or prioritizing people, care, and humanity. While they were organizing the trip, Ethan showed signs of anxiety. He moved less, looked at Richard with a mixture of fear and confidence. The child seemed to sense that something big was about to happen, something he himself couldn't control. Richard understood that this was the ultimate test of his ability to be present, to act with empathy and courage. Meanwhile, within Hale Industries, Mark intensified his pressure. Employees and middle managers began reporting every small move by the board. Strategies and decisions were accelerated, contracts revised, and expansion projects postponed or cancelled. The silent battle for control of the company was approaching a critical point. Richard, even though physically distant, felt the need to intervene with strategic decisions, but without compromising his attention to Ethan's life. The atmosphere inside the hospital became increasingly tense. Weather conditions complicated travel and logistics. Essential equipment arrived late, and the medical team had to improvise quick solutions. Each obstacle tested the resilience of everyone: doctors, family members, and Richard. On a particularly cold afternoon, Richard led Ethan to the lobby window. Observing the snow covering the garden, he spoke for the first time directly about what lay ahead. "Are you ready to try something new?" he asked, not in a commanding tone but with confidence and care. Ethan nodded. There were no words to fully express what he felt. His fixed gaze, his hand squeezing Ethan's, conveyed courage and determination. Right then and there, Richard realized that everything he had learned up to that point, patience, observation, trust, overcoming challenges, would be put to the ultimate test. The climax was approaching not just as an external event, but as an internal test of character, presence, and human connection. Every decision, every action, every choice of presence would be crucial. The moment to prove that true leadership is not measured in contracts or profits, but in care, courage, and responsibility was about to arrive. The day of the trip to the specialized center arrived. Snow covered Boston in a thick layer, making streets and sidewalks slippery. Richard drove carefully, his eyes alternating between Ethan and the traffic, each minute fraught with tension. Every decision seemed critical. A delay, a miscalculated turn, a slip on the road could jeopardize everything. Ethan was quieter than usual. The child in the wheelchair breathed deeply, as if sensing the importance of the moment. Richard squeezed his hand discreetly, without words, conveying confidence and presence. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of weeks of learning and transformation. Upon arriving at the specialized hospital, the medical team awaited them. Richard guided Ethan to the elevator, observing each step, each necessary precaution. The snow was turning to thin ice in the parking lot, reminding Richard of the day he had fallen in the mud. The parallel between fragility and strength seemed unavoidable. Inside the center, advanced tests revealed the true state of Ethan's condition. The unexpected complications required a complex procedure, but the chance of success was significant. Richard understood that everything depended on that moment. There was no contract that guaranteed results, no financial team that could solve it. Only courage, precision, and presence. The surgery began. Richard remained in the waiting room, beside Laura, holding her hand, breathing cautiously. Each minute seemed to last hours. Every step of the medical team resonated in his heart. He realized that the vulnerability he had once feared was now a source of strength. The responsibility of being present transformed fear into action, anxiety into attentiveness. Hours later, the procedure was successfully completed. Ethan awoke in the recovery room, confused but reassured. The first shy smile that appeared was enough for Richard to understand the depth of the experience. He had witnessed something impossible, something that no contract or wealth could provide. As they left the city center, the snow-covered town looked different. Richard watched Ethan maneuvering his wheelchair with greater autonomy, each movement filled with confidence and determination. The victory wasn't just medical, it was emotional, human, about growth and overcoming challenges. That same day, Richard received news from Hale Industries. The stock was stabilizing, and the board had recognized the importance of ethical and responsible leadership. Mark Caldwell had consolidated administrative functions, but the absence of authoritarian decisions and Richard's return to a more humane approach had restored the confidence of investors and employees. The tension between the corporate and human worlds had finally found a balance. Richard understood that although he had lost some control over business, he had gained something much greater: understanding, presence, courage, and a real connection with people. The climax wasn't just the surgery or Ethan's recovery, but Richard's complete transformation. He had learned to value the impossible, not what money can buy, but what the heart achieves when it allows itself to hold the hand of someone in need. The days following the surgery were marked by small advances and quiet victories. Ethan regained confidence in his own mobility, though still physically limited. But each achievement was celebrated as an absolute triumph. Richard remained by his side, not as a millionaire or executive, but as a constant presence, firm, attentive, and human. In the corporate world, Hale Industries began to stabilize. Mark Caldwell continued to act as the operational arm, but Richard had redefined the rules of the game. It was no longer about dominating or controlling, but about leading with responsibility and empathy. Contracts and investments began to reflect a balanced vision, showing that power without care was useless. Laura became an even closer ally. Her partnership with Richard solidified based on trust and mutual respect. The shared experience in the hospital strengthened silent bonds. Each gesture, each joint decision, each moment of attention transformed the relationship into something deep and lasting. Richard, for his part, changed visibly. Life no longer allowed him to chase status or figures. He had learned that absolute control is an illusion, and that some hands, small and fragile, can teach lessons impossible to learn in offices or meetings. True strength lay in the courage to be present, to face uncertainties, to act with empathy. Ethan continued his therapy routine, but now with more consistent results. Each advance reflected the combined effort: doctor, family, friend, and mentor. Richard understood that his journey, previously measured by power and money, had found real meaning in the daily overcoming of a child who taught him more than he could ever imagine. The millionaire who had fallen into ruin, defeated by chance and helplessness, now walked side by side with Ethan. Together they had proven that the impossible is not an insurmountable barrier, but an invitation to courage, resilience, and human connection. Life, once fragmented between business and ego, was now intertwined with humanity, presence, and purpose. And this learning would remain forever, more valuable than any fortune or title ever earned. Months later, Boston seemed less merciless. Ethan maneuvered his wheelchair through the hospital's inner garden with growing confidence. Richard, beside him, smiled naturally, now accustomed to measuring achievements by human impact rather than status. Laura watched from afar, aware that this change in Richard was not temporary, but a definitive transformation. The millionaire who had fallen into the mud had learned the most valuable lesson. Some hands, even small ones, can guide entire lives. The city remained impassive around them, but inside the hospital and in the lives of Richard and Ethan, something was happening that would never be the same again. An impossible connection had become reality, and the feeling of presence had forever transformed everything that had previously seemed unattainable. If you were moved by Richard and Ethan's story, share this account and inspire others to value presence, empathy, and courage in their own lives. Every act of care can transform the impossible into reality, just like a helping hand at the right moment. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow more stories that show that humanity, resilience, and connection are within everyone's reach, even in the most challenging times.